We do this thing during our spring fun drive where sometimes I ask you questions. You love it when I do
love this.
I quiz you.
I'm so happy right now.
So here's my question for you, Libby. Do you know who first said the phrase grand salami time?
That would be Dave Niehaus.
That would be Dave Niehaus,
Yay!
famous.
Ding, ding, ding,
See,
ding, ding,
I
ding.
figured it'd be so easy for you. Famous radio announcer Dave Niehaus, first 34 seasons of the Mariners' existence, one of the most famous sportscasters in history. Here's another thing he said about the power of radio while receiving an award at the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 2008. Radio plays with the mind. It gives you a mental workout and delusions of grandeur. And my question is, do you think that's true of podcasts? Delusions of grandeur? A mental workout? We're a mental workout,
Yeah,
right?
we are certainly a mental workout, and we are certainly delusional.
If you feel half as sentimental about radio or podcasts as Dave Niehaus did, right now, this is the time of year when we ask you to donate to keep your local public radio up and running. If you donate and go to KUOW.org/politics and donate there, that it basically is like a vote for us. It basically tells our bosses, these are people who listen to this podcast who specifically want you to know they're supporting the podcast.
Yeah, it's like an endorsement of the work that we're doing here on Sound Politics, and we appreciate every single gift. We get a little notification when a gift comes through. It is just a little boost to know that you're out there and you're listening and you appreciate us.
When you leave little notes in there, we read them. We could even read them on the show. So if you really feel moved right now, I want you to go to KUOW.org/politics and get that endorsement in. We really appreciate it. It really makes a difference to us. And I would just really love it if you did that. So with that out of the way,
let's get delusional.
Let's get delusional. Let's get a mental workout in. It's time for Sound Politics. You're listening to Sonic Politics.
What?
I'm Scott Greenstone.
I'm Libby Denkmann. This week, a big vote happened, not in the state legislature or city hall, but over in New York, where the owners of the NBA franchises, they approved exploring 2 possible expansion teams.
That's basketball teams.
Yes.
For those of you that don't know the NBA.
Indeed.
Yeah.
We need to clarify that the NBA is basketball. Okay, let's set the stakes here.
This is a politics podcast.
And the cities they chose for said new basketball teams were Las Vegas and Seattle. So that's welcome news, of course, to long-suffering fans of the Seattle Supersonics. The city's former NBA team packed up and moved out of town in 2008, broke our hearts, never really have healed after all those years.
And if this all goes to plan, Seattle's new team would begin playing during the 2028 to 2029 season. Seattle retained the Supersonics name and brand when the team moved to Oklahoma City. So if this NBA deal goes through, the new team could be called the Sonics, just like before. All of a sudden, it could be 2008 again in Seattle. Obama's America. Everything would rewind. Excitement is high.
I mean, flared jeans and like crop tops are in, so I could see it. We're back in 2008.
Going to watch The Hangover in theaters. Excitement is high. Even politicians are jumping on board this wave of sentiment. So if you've been wondering why elected officials have been releasing resolutions and statements saying we're ready for the Sonics, or posting awkward videos where they throw basketballs with teens.
I don't actually think many people have been wondering that. I think it's mostly political reporters like us who have been getting all of these statements. Yeah. They, politicians love to claim victory, and they also love to prove that they're normal people. And they like sports.
I think that's true. But there has been maybe more frenzy around this than
totally
is normal, right? It's a big deal. I mean, Governor Bob Ferguson has met twice with NBA Commissioner Adam Silver.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. And we don't fully know the details of what they talked about in those meetings, but Ferguson posted on X after the Monday meeting, quote, "It remains a top priority for me to bring back the Sonics. Top priority.
Yeah.
Of course, the statements and posts and all this excitement have really kind of driven into the next level now that the NBA Board of Governors vote has happened.
And, as we've talked about all this and why would we talk about this on a politics podcast, my question is, what do politicians get, out of these resolutions and statements other than just pretending to be relatable, pretending to be one of the fans?
I do think that the whole story of the Sonics leaving, that sad tale that we've been telling ourselves for 18 years, it's a political one as much of a sports one, because ultimately it had to do with taxpayer dollars, these big stadium projects and what people actually wanted their money to go towards. So we're going to talk about that today, the politics behind the Sonics leaving in the first place. And maybe we're going to have time to answer your question as well, Scott. So what do politicians gain when something big happens in the local world of sports?
Right, if they're not on DraftKings. All that on today's Sound Politics after this break.
And we're back with Sound Politics. And Scott, we're not sports journalists. Today, we have a ringer here, literally. Jordan Ritter-Kahn, who among many other hats, he hosted a podcast called Sonic Boom, How Seattle Lost Its Team. It's a multi-part show from The Ringer. Jordan, good to see you again. Welcome to Sound Politics.
Thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Hey, Jordan. So first, for our listeners who are like me and weren't here when the Sonics left almost 20 years ago, can you give us a very basic description of why they left and what they meant to the city and the fans?
As for why they left, they left for the real only reason teams ever leave cities, and that is that the billionaires who own the teams decide that they want a new building in which they can extract more money from their fans, and the city did not want to give them that new building. The ownership of the Sonics at the time, led by Howard Schultz, wanted to renovate, replace Key Arena, and there was a lot of opposition to that in the city, a lot of opposition to that among local politicians, state politicians, among activists in town. There's a lot of fatigue over new stadiums that have been built for other teams in town. And he eventually decided to sell the team to a group of investors from Oklahoma led by Clay Bennett, saying that maybe having outsiders own the team would put enough pressure on the city to build this new building. That did not happen. What happened instead was what everyone predicted, which is Clay Bennett and the group of investors decided we're going to leave this city and go back to our home and move into a building in Oklahoma City, and they will become the now defending NBA champion, Oklahoma City Thunder.
Oh, that stings, Jordan. That does sting.
I know. It was for a long time, people thought that maybe the Thunder were cursed because of what had happened to Seattle, and then they won the title last year. I know there was a lot of mourning up in your part of the world, and understandably so, but maybe that title kind of unleashed something that is allowing for the Sonics to potentially return. But in terms of what they left, I mean, just what continues to be a passionate and engaged fan base. I haven't been into Seattle since last year. I'll be there again in a couple months, but every time I'm there, I'm struck by the number of Sonics hats, jerseys, T-shirts that I see. The number of people who call themselves Sonics fans, present tense. Even people who are from a generation that barely remembers when the Sonics were in town. They still feel that connection to that team and feel like it's a part of the city's identity.
So the third episode of Sonic Boom is called Olympia, and it's all about the local politicians at the center of this debate back in the mid-2000s, how the state legislature played a role in the team's departure. Today we're seeing politicians all sort of like jump to take credit for what's happening as the return of the Sonics seems more and more likely. Governor Bob Ferguson meeting with the NBA commissioner, Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson hanging out at Rainier Beach High School, shooting hoops with some teens. We have a little clip of that.
We've been preparing, and Seattle's ready to take our shot. Let's bring the Supersonics home.
And she did take some free throws. One was successful. One went in.
There were some misses.
There were a few misses. But back in 2006, 2008, taxpayers had already funded two major sports venues, like Safeco Field had taken a big chunk of taxpayer money that later became, T-Mobile Park is how people know it today. Lumen Fields, back then it was CenturyLink, also funded largely a big chunk of it by taxpayers. But then the legislature and, voters in Seattle, they started drawing a line. What do you think led to the souring of the mood towards publicly funded stadiums, Jordan?
The term that they used at the time was stadium fatigue. Just this idea that we've done this. There had been, in addition to that, a renovation to Key Arena in the 90s that was kind of a half-hearted renovation that did not go all the way to kind of bringing it up to standard with the arenas across the league. But when you have that renovation in the 90s plus two others for the other franchises in town, there's just this sense of like, why are we continuing to give money to these franchises to renovate their arenas when there's so many other things that money can be going toward. And so there was kind of a lot of momentum for standing up to the bullies, as they were kind of framed, of these rich men who own these franchises and want money for their arenas. And so I think that there's kind of the really the moment that really kind of crystallized all of this was this moment at, like you said, in Olympia, when then NBA Commissioner David Stern and Howard Schultz come to town to ask for $200 million to go toward this renovation and replacement of Key Arena. And they walk into the room expecting that they're going to be able to get what they want. And instead they come up against House Speaker at the time, Frank Chopp, who is a man who feels very passionately that the state of Washington has much more serious problems that deserve public funding. And Stern and Schultz are two men who are very accustomed to being the most powerful person in every single room that they enter. And on that day in that room, they were not as powerful as Frank Chopp. And he kind of humiliated them to such a degree that Stern brought his name up in press conferences and interviews for years afterward. There was a lot of theatrics to that hearing. That there was a chance for some real grandstanding, some standing up against these rich, powerful people who think that they could get what they want. It did not go well for Stern, did not go well for Schultz. Frank Chopp got what he wanted in that moment. Whether it is what he would have wanted in the end with the team leaving the city, I think is harder to say.
This was a real, when I was looking, this was a real like Leo DiCaprio pointing at the screen moment when he comes up in Sonic Boom, because I've written about Frank Chopp before, and I had to think about the fact that this was in 2006, and Frank Chopp had likely just come off of a few really brutal sessions after the dot-com bust, having to broker deals to try not to cut public services, things like the housing vouchers and subsidies for very poor folks, trying to keep them off the chopping block. That had to be in his mind when he's talking to David Stern and Howard Schultz, these very rich men who want public money for stadiums.
And you're asking me for hundreds of millions to, build you another new fancy building for your sports team. Jordan, this is obviously a period where people like this group, Citizens for More Important Things, they were getting traction. Like, people were kind of nodding and saying, yeah, that, like, why are we spending money on these stadiums? But then, years go by and these upgrades to what was Key Arena, now Climate Pledge Arena, they happen with private financing. I mean, Oakview Group, the developer, Amazon with the naming rights, the Kraken ownership group builds that new version of the stadium with a Sonics locker room already built, like in mind. So all of this eventually, years later, happens with private financing. Do you think that says anything about like the era of public funding for stadiums overall? Like, is that era where taxpayers foot the bill dead?
I would not say it's dead, but certainly there has been a shift. And the groups that own these franchises sometimes now like to finance everything privately, because if you take public money, you have to cut a deal with the local government that can sometimes include certain wage guarantees for the workers, that can include things like affordable housing as part of like a larger development around the site of the arena. Cities tend to, in part, kind of born out of some of these deals in the early and mid 2000s, cities kind of throw their weight around and demand a lot from these groups if they're going to kick in some money. And if the groups come in and say, well, we'll just pay for the whole thing ourselves, then they can build it however they want. They can develop the property around the arena however they want. And I think a lot of ownership groups have come to see that as more attractive than taking a deal for some public money that comes along with certain stipulations.
So the team departs for Oklahoma City in 2008. The next year in Seattle, Mayor Greg Nichols loses re-election. And just to be clear, the Sonics leaving Seattle is probably not the main reason, may not be the only reason, but
we all remember Snowplow Gate.
Right, exactly. Snowpocalypse 09. But generally there were just bad vibes, and I think some people believe it may have been part of the story for why he lost his second re-election bid. Soundside, Libby's show, interviewed him recently and asked him about why some voters blamed him for losing the team.
I remember very well the Sonics championship back in the late 70s, but my job wasn't as a basketball fan. It was as mayor of the city and responsible to the taxpayers of the city.
So since then, it's been 18 years, lots of false starts, false hopes, lots of politicians talking about bringing this team back to Seattle. Jordan, you talked to former Mayor Bruce Harrell about bringing back the Sonics. It seems like he worked on it. He certainly talked about it a lot. I don't know if he will get the credit. Honestly, one of the things was he talked about it so much. It started getting, I think, I don't know if it's just me as like not a huge sports person. It seemed like a lot. Here he is during his State of the City speech just last year when he took a break, pulled a basketball out of the podium where he was standing and said,
I have an announcement to make. I'm just kidding. I got
I cannot believe you. That was messed up.
It did not go over very well. Harold actually apologized for it later. And then meanwhile, we heard that Katie Wilson clip earlier, right? She beat him last year in his reelection bid, but she has done practically nothing to bring back the Sonics as far as we can tell.
I mean, she hasn't had any time. She just got into office in January.
Exactly, right. So, Jordan, as someone who's done a lot of research into this, do you think voters blamed Nichols or the state legislature or local politicians? And I guess, will they give Katie Wilson credit? And if so, how much?
You know, I think there was certainly some blame for Greg Nichols from fans and voters at the time. I would not say that he was seen as the kind of chief villain in the story. That would certainly be Howard Schultz for the decision to sell the team. Yeah. But one of the big things that did come up was that the city had filed a lawsuit against the NBA, kind of just trying to fight to keep the team in town for as long as possible, to get like another year, hoping that then they could come to a deal that would keep the team there long term. And the city ultimately decided to drop that lawsuit, paving the way for the team to move in 2008. And the city attorney at the time, Tom Carr, told me that the NBA had more or less said to him, if you keep this lawsuit going, we will make sure that Seattle never gets a team again. And that was a big reason why they dropped that suit. But at the time, it looked to a lot of people like the city was giving up, like they were no longer fighting to keep the team. In terms of like credit that politicians might get, I think it's I'm sure there is a rush to claim credit. It is the sort of thing that cuts across constituencies, that cuts across all sorts of different interest groups. People will like having a professional basketball team in the city, and it's kind of an easy thing to make a lot of people very, very happy. I'm skeptical as to whether voters would see a politician as being responsible for something like this,
because they're not really ultimately, right, Jordan?
This was set in motion and in some ways became almost inevitable the moment the renovations, the rebuilding for Climate Pledge happened. The moment that the Kraken were announced as coming to town, and that Climate Pledge was going to be a world-class state-of-the-art arena, it was somewhat inevitable that if Seattle just played it cool, was patient, eventually the NBA would want a team to be back there. And so it's hard to say that, other than doing whatever needed to be done to ultimately allow for those renovations to take place, again, with private money, it's hard to say that any politician really did a ton other than, keeping up a vibe of optimism, putting certain people into conversations with others so that hopefully they can, keep momentum going.
It's interesting, though, because so when we originally conceived of this episode, we were talking about how sports and politics intertwine, and specifically, do sports impact how voters feel about local politicians? And I threw out the question, if the Mariners had gone to the World Series last year, would Mayor Bruce Harrell have won re-election? And what is crazy about that is, as we did a little research into this, and you may know this already, Jordan, but there is some evidence that home team wins make people feel better about incumbent mayors. Like one study looked at 39 different cities from 1948 to 2009 and found that there is a relationship between teams that win a lot more in the year leading up to an election and the incumbent mayor getting more votes in that election. It's somewhat small, but sometimes enough to win a close election. The really crazy part about that study that I looked at from 2012 is when teams made the playoffs, the mayor's chances of re-election were roughly 9% higher. And that statistical analysis I'm talking about found sports teams winning was even more important than unemployment numbers.
Oh, my God.
Which is crazy because we always talk about unemployment numbers with hand in hand with approval ratings. So I know we're really speculating here, but is this part of the calculus? Do you think, politicians are thinking about this? If this team does well, maybe I'll win re-election, or am I just being too conspiratorial here?
That data is fascinating. I had not heard that. But there is something about when a team is winning, it just feels very good to be in the city. With the Mariners in the fall, I'm sure the weather is getting cooler. Everyone's outside. You feel connected to people who are, strangers who you otherwise would not make eye contact with on the street.
It's civic pride. Yeah.
You're talking Seattle's language right now. Otherwise would not make eye contact with on the street.
But there is a sense of civic pride that you feel as you're walking around, and you feel like we're a winning city. That that extends beyond the baseball field or beyond the basketball arena.
It is a thing that can make you feel pride in your city in ways that go beyond just I am watching on television and seeing this team with Seattle across their chest winning games. It changes the experience of being in the city. And certainly I can see how you might kind of remember a particular politician who was in office at a particular moment and think, you know what, I felt pretty good when that person was in office. They seem all right. Let's keep it going.
That's Jordan Ritter-Kahn, senior staff writer at The Ringer, host of the great podcast Sonic Boom, which if you want to learn the ins and outs of what happened in that rough period of losing the Sonics in 2006, 2008, it's a great listen. Jordan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
That's it for Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone. Our editor is Kat Smith. Our producer is Gabby Healy.
I really have to go work on my free throws now. I'm inspired by
yeah.
Mayor Wilson.
I can't criticize her. My 3 free throws are terrible.
I'm Libby Denkmann. This show is only possible because of you. Your support makes it possible.
Right.
Please make a donation at kuow.org/politics.
You've been doing that all day.
That is about the 9 millionth time I have asked for a donation to KUOW. And you know what? It's all worth it because truly we do rely on you guys, on the listener.
Make it worth it for Libby. Don't make her do this. Keep doing this again and again. Go to kuow.org/politics, give, and help us out here.
Thank you.